That was close. Right. Hello, everybody. Well, welcome to Cheltenham Science Festival. My name is Mark Miodownik. I'm a material scientist, actually, from King's College London. And King's are sponsoring this event because Daniel Freeman, our main speaker, is our only speaker, in fact, is a Wellcome Trust Fellow and a consultant clinical psychologist from South London and Maudsley NHS Trust Foundation.
That's right, yep.
He's an academic at King's College London, and he's recently, I think it's in 2009, that you got the British Psychology Society's May Davidson Prize. Is that right? For his contribution to clinical psychology. So you're in the presence of someone who, I think it would be clear to say that you know more about paranoia than I think most people on the planet. So it's a very, very...
I think you say more than needed.
Don't be paranoid, no. It's with great pleasure, and we feel very lucky to be able to have got an hour of your time today to talk about this fascinating subject. The way we're going to kind of run the event today is we're going to let Daniel really just talk for about 20 or 30 minutes about his view on the subject as well as his recent work, and then open it up for questions to the audience. And when we do that, there'll be some roaming mics, and if you could just wait until one of these gets to you, and we'll really try and get through as many questions as possible, because I know that this is something that people really want to kind of get involved with. So we'll try and get you involved as much as possible. Okay, so Daniel, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. This is going to be a talk on paranoia, but I want to start on an issue I think that's in many of our minds, which is that there are real threats out there. For example, terrorism. And the Home Office is responsible for keeping us safe from the threats posed by terrorists. And at the moment, the UK terrorism threat level is severe. This means a terrorist attack is highly likely. Now, I'm sure you're an altruistic bunch, and I'm sure you're sitting there thinking, well, what can I do? Well, thankfully, the Home Office provide advice, and it's mainly always report suspicious activity. But they also provide some further guidance. They say, while it's important that we all go about our daily business normally, it's also sensible to remain alert to danger and to report any suspicious activity you see or hear. Know who and what you expect to see each day within your neighbourhood, and report anything suspicious. Ask yourself, is there anything out of place? Is there anything there that is not usually there? Is my home as I left it? And trust your instincts. If you feel something is wrong, tell those in charge, okay? For the next hour, that's Mark here. Now, one place we're bound to feel nervous is on an aeroplane. And I want to take you back to a Ryanair flight in 2006, where there was what was described as an alert psychology lecturer. Now, he noticed this very suspicious group who were in high spirits in the terminal building, but once the flight was called, their behaviour changed completely. They sat separately and remained largely silent. There was no eye contact between them. But most troubling for this psychologist is that one of the members was blind, but he appeared to be reading a newspaper. The psychologist reported the suspicious activity to an attendant, as it should do, and there was what was described as rising tension within the aeroplane. And the plane's captain described the psychologist as credible and sensible. As a consequence, 5 suspected terrorists were escorted by gunpoint off this plane. But this was no terrorist cell. This was members of the Caribbean Steel International Orchestra. They just played a world music festival on the island there, and the band did include the world's only blind tenor pan player. He was just leaning over to hear the football results read out from the newspaper. And the group is split up so that some of them could take window seats. This group has become known as the Taliban. As an interesting coda, they later played at the opening of Heathrow's Terminal 5. Just could not make this up. But it seems right now we're jumpy, paranoid, even psychologists. And when I talk about paranoia, I'm talking about the exaggerated or unfounded ideas that others are deliberately intending to cause us harm. Now, it was never thought that psychologists got paranoid. In fact, it was never thought that anyone got paranoid, apart from those with severe mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. Those were the only people who got paranoid. And the reason for that, well, we have to go back in time. We have to go back to this beautiful Greek island in the 4th century, which is Kos, birthplace of Hippocrates, the founder of medicine. He had a very important role in the history of paranoia because he used the term meaning out of one's mind to the delirium of high fever, to the confused ramblings that someone has when they're acutely, physically unwell. It's right then, back then, that paranoia became locked into a discourse of irrationality and derangement. And this was very much picked up by psychiatric systems which were developed in the 18th century and onwards. Paranoia only happened in those with severe mental illnesses. What's been missed is everyday suspicions in the workplace, outside, in the home and on aeroplanes of common mistrust and paranoia. And what I want to argue today is that paranoia is actually very common. There's a spectrum of severity in the general population. And I'm also going to make an argument that perhaps it's on the rise. I want to tell you about a unique scientific experiment that's demonstrated how common paranoia is. And this used virtual reality, which is an interactive computer environment. People react in virtual worlds as they do in the real world, so that's important to bear in mind. And what was done was presented people with exactly the same neutral social environment. So the characters were programmed to behave neutral. So if anyone perceived any hostility, we know it's true paranoia. No matter what the person did, they couldn't elicit a hostile reaction from the computer characters. Tested 200 members of the general public. I recruited them, just provided this leaflet that was sent out to local postcodes. It doesn't mention paranoia. 100 men, 100 women. The only exclusion was those who had a history of severe mental illness. And they came here to my laboratory, which does not have this on the door, but here you can see the 3 key elements of virtuality. There's a computer generating images, a headset that displays them 3-dimensionally, and there's trackers on the ceilings that enable the computer to update the images, okay? So it's an interactive experience. And all they did was a sort of 5-minute London Underground journey, okay? We should see a clip here. This would be in 3 dimensions in the headset. The characters are animated using recordings of real people, using optical motion capture. And the computer programmer has put himself there right at the back with a beard. So all the participants do, one at a time, is spend 5 minutes on this London Underground tube ride. Okay, what did they make of this experience? Here's some reactions. It was nice, much nicer than the real experience. People aren't so forthcoming with their feelings in a real situation, thought they were pretty friendly. People were generally very friendly. The man in the pink jumper might have chatted me up. There were people smiling at you, which was nice. Felt like a normal tube, people just trying to get where they want to go. I didn't think anyone thought anything about me, all getting on with their own business. Nobody seemed to notice me. Here's reactions from the people who had the same tube ride. There was an aggressive person whose intention was to intimidate me and make me feel uneasy. When he reacted like that, I turned around and backed away. One guy looked pissed off and maybe one guy flicked the finger at me. There's something dodgy about one guy, like he was about to do something, assault someone, plant a bomb, say something not nice to me, be aggressive. Thought a couple of the men were stuck up and nasty. The lady sitting down laughed at me when I walked past. And the last one isn't paranoid, but I really quite like it. One real miserable bastard, a miserable trout face. What we have here is a striking demonstration of how people can view the same situation completely differently. And I assessed paranoid thoughts. Here's some examples of the questions that were asked of the people. So someone had it in for me, someone was trying to intimidate me, those sorts of questions. And there was appreciable endorsement, okay? So if someone stared at me in order to upset me, 3/4 of people didn't agree, 11% agreed a little, 6% agreed moderately, 2.5% agreed very much, and 3% agreed totally. Someone wanted me to feel threatened again. 80% didn't agree, but 20% endorsed that to some extent. The most common reactions were this is a friendly or neutral tube, but 1 in 3 people in this general population sample had a paranoid thought about the computer characters. Now, the Sun newspaper, what you may not know about the Sun is that avid readers of the British Journal of Psychiatry, where this research was published, with their usual clarity, they broke the news. 1/3 of Brits are paranoid. And they also provided a cut-out and keep anti-paranoia card for people. I think the kittens look a bit frightening to me, but there we go. And in a pinnacle for research scientists, they also discussed the results in their News in Briefs section in page 3. Keeley said, there's nothing to worry about over the news, 1/3 of Brits are paranoid. She said, it's crazy so many people are worried all the time. It's probably part of a government conspiracy to control our thoughts or some sort of stealth tax. She got less helpful as she went on there, Keeley. Now, I'm not just interested in how common paranoia is, I'm interested in what the causes are in order to develop better treatments as a psychologist. And what we know is there are a number of factors that raise the risk of paranoid thoughts. We know people who are high in anxiety, who anticipate threat, are more likely to have paranoia. Worriers are more likely to have paranoia. Worry takes you to more implausible places. People who have negative ideas about themselves feel vulnerable to harm and therefore at risk. People who've had bad things happen in the past are more likely to be paranoid, understandably. People have perceptual anomalies. People who have, for example, things seem too bright or vivid or sounds too loud or intrusive. Mild perceptual anomalies are a predictor of paranoia. And one that we're beginning to look at is also insomnia. We've got less good evidence about this, but I want to tell you about some new research that established for the first time there's a substantial association. And this is work from the British Psychiatric Morbidity Survey. We interviewed 8,500 people in the UK. This showed that sleep problems were common. 1/3 of people reported difficulties in the past month with getting to sleep. 10% reported this occurring at least 4 nights in the past week. And about 6% reported these sorts of problems occurring for over 6 months. Okay, so sleep problems are remarkably common. But they were associated with paranoid thoughts, with mistrust of other people. Those who had insomnia were 3 times more likely to report feeling suspicious of other people. Now, this is the first time it's been looked at on such a large scale. It's only an association. It doesn't always tell you about cause. However, it's certainly gathering other data that's suggestive that insomnia can trigger more mistrust of other people. I have a website called paranoidthoughts.com. This is the only website on paranoia. You're probably not surprised to hear that. What's good about this site, though, is that people can leave their own experiences of paranoia. It's a forum for talking about paranoid thoughts. And just picked out one example of this from Sam. I'm so bloody happy after reading this. It's not just me. I thought I was going blooming crazy. I've taken a piece of all bits of your advice and it's really worked for me. Everyone was laughing at me, I thought, but in hindsight, not at all. Self-esteem has so much to do with it. Value yourself. Corny, but so true. When you have a weird thought that someone's out to humiliate you, do you wrong, it's hardly ever the case. You just assume they will because of lack of respect in yourself or think you deserve it, or bad experiences. Think about all the healthy, fun relationships you have. Put negativity aside. Negativity breeds negativity. Sorry for a long ramble, just being positive. So paranoia causes individual distress, but I also think it's important at a societal level. This interesting study from the States of 7,500 people, it showed the areas with high levels of mistrust had lower levels of civic engagement. So, for example, less membership of voluntary groups. And areas with more mistrust had higher mortality rates. Across the trust, a 10% rise in trust was associated with a decrease, 8%, in death rates. Mistrust was associated with death from every cause, apart from, perhaps ironically, accidents. So I think it's very important that we address this question: are we entering an age of paranoia? No one's regularly taken surveys of paranoia because they only thought it occurred in people with severe mental illness. So we don't know for sure. But I'm going to try and make a brief argument that perhaps we are entering an age of paranoia. To start this off, I just want you to listen to this list of names. Gordon Brown, Elizabeth Park, Tony Blair, Adrian Booth, Michael Palin, Delia Smith, Alfred Hitchcock, Isabel Jacobs, Jenny Wirral, Alan Bennett, Laura Heyman, Claire Jones, Wayne Rooney, Elizabeth Griffin, Pippa McKay, Juliana Greening, Nick Clegg, Charles Darwin, Joe Brand, Catherine Bennett, Mark Byman, Caitlin Welling, Natasha Treacher, Lydia Hughes, Isaac Newton, Ian Pickering, Desmond Tutu, Katie Huntley, Homer Simpson, Heston Blumenthal, Patricia Butler, Judi Dench, Fiona Storr, Tracy Woodcock, Magella Adams, Michael Jackson, Caroline Williams, Alice Bramman, George Clooney, Daniel Craig, Sigmund Freud, Mary Ambery, Barack Obama, Lisa Baxter. Now, what you need to do is just at the top of your head to make a judgment about what proportion of the list you think was male and what proportion of the list was female. Okay, we're going to do a show of hands. So, who thought A? It's 40% male, 60% female.
We might get the lights up here.
Yeah.
Get the lights.
I can see. We put the lights up on one person at the back there. Okay, that's one person. Who goes for B? 45% male, 55% female. Few people for that. C, 50-50. A lot of people have gone for that. D, 55% male, 45% female. Quite a lot have gone for that as well. E, 60% male, 40% female. Yep, a lot of people have gone for that. F, other. Can't ask anyone about their Fs, okay. And the answer is 45% male, 55% female. What was typical here, as you react, is that most people overestimate the number of male names on that list. I'll explain why in a moment. Now, there's a long psychological history of showing that we seldom reason logically. We use shortcuts, what's technically called reasoning heuristics. And one of the most famous is something called the availability heuristic. We make estimates of the likelihood of an event simply by how easily we can bring it to mind. And that's what happened with the names task, because there were more male famous names on that list. Therefore, they were easier to bring to mind, and that skewed your judgment of how common they were. And there's a lot of work showing that it's really exacerbated by emotional material. If you think about having the symptoms of an illness, if you think about being arrested for a crime, you then overestimate, or it increases your estimation of how likely the event is to happen to you. This is how the National Lottery works. It's very easy to have an image of winning, and therefore it skews your judgment. Now, what we know of the wider world largely comes from the media. Given we're vulnerable to this skew, we better hope their coverage is objective, proportionate, and measured. So I'll come to that. It's going to be another show of hands on a slightly more morbid subject, but I just want some people to provide an estimate of how many people each year die from cancer. Okay, who goes for A? More than 100,000. Okay, a few people for that. B, 50,000 to 100,000. Yep, a few more for that. C, 25 to 50,000. Yep, that's probably the most common response there. D, 10,000 to 25,000. Yep, quite a lot of people have gone for that as well. E, less than 25,000. Okay, fair number have gone for that too. And the answer is A. It's actually more than 140,000 people each year die from cancer. What about the number of murders? Who's going to go for A? More than 2,000. I think one person's done that, I can see. B, 1,500 to 2,000. Few people. C, 1,000 to 1,500. Few people. D, 500 to 1,000. Okay, yeah, lots of people have gone for that. E, 0 to 500. And most people have gone for that. And the answer is D. It's about 700, okay? And actually, what happens is people are pretty good on that. But the important thing to bear in mind is that your estimations of murder are greatly overestimated in contrast to deaths from cancer, okay? So we overestimate the number of murders relative to the main killers such as cancer and heart disease and stroke. And one explanation for this may be the media coverage. We know certain stories are overreported. There's a great newsroom cliche, if it bleeds, it leads. And there's some data here, just looking at the number of times murder and cancer are mentioned in newspapers. And murders roughly approximately has double the mentions than cancer, despite several hundred more times people dying from cancer than are murdered each year. The media prefers reporting dramatic one-off episodes of drama and conflict. And I think it's getting worse. I think there's an upward trend. Here's a chart, you may read it very well, of some common bêtes noires. For example, terrorists in 1995 reported 98 times in the Mirror. By 2006, it was doubled to 208, and similarly in the Times. You might think that's a war on terror, but actually, back in 1995, we were having IRA attacks in England. Paedophiles are mentioned 15 times in the Times back in 1995, and that's up to 73 times in the last months of 2006, and there's been no increase in the rate of paedophilia. Criminals, again, has been dramatically more mentions in the media over time. And I guess the argument is over-reporting of threats fosters paranoia. If you don't believe me, think about watching the movie Jaws and then going swimming in the sea immediately after, okay? Does anyone know how many people die of shark deaths every year? 5, yes, about 4 or 5 people are killed each year across the world, not in the area that the book was set. Do you know how many sharks are killed by humans every year? Hundreds. It's actually 40 million. So in the great battle between sharks and humans, it's quite clear which side you want to be on. And arguably, the Jaws kind of mood music in our environment these days is provided by CCTV cameras, possibly. Now, I don't think paranoia may just be on the rise because of this interaction between the way we reason and the media. I think there's a number of social factors. I'm just going to highlight a couple of these. Firstly, this is Camberwell, where I live and work, and for the first time, half of the humanity now lives in areas such as this, in urban areas. In 1800, it was 5%, and it's estimated to increase to 65% by 2030. There are large epidemiological studies showing that the rates of paranoia are at least twice as high in urban areas than rural. In the latest birth cohorts, these rates are even higher. It's plausible that on the back of this galloping urbanisation will be an increase in paranoia. There's also a lot of evidence showing that people who've been victimised have increased rates of paranoia. It's not surprising if you've been mugged, for example. The weeks and months later, when you go out, you may be easily startled, anxious and fearful. And I'm sure as many of you know, since the 1950s, one of the markers of victimisation, crime, has risen dramatically. Back in 1955, there were 5 crimes per 1,000 of the population. By 1997, it was up to 89 crimes per 1,000. Again, it's plausible on the back of this real danger has been an increase in mistrust and suspicion. But actually there's a twist to this story, which is that perhaps many of you know, since 1997, crime rates have definitely been coming down. It's disputed by how much, but it's clearly come down. Yet every year in the British Crime Survey of 60,000 people, 2 out of 3 people will say crime has increased in the past year. Our perceptions have become rather detached from the reality. And finally, I just want to sort of flag up the issue of conspiracies and cover-ups. We're much more aware of these, and that's a good thing. However, I think sometimes it does lead to a total breakdown in trust. And I'm going to give one example of that. There's surveys from the state showing that a proportion of African Americans, in this survey 27%, believed that AIDS was a man-made virus that the federal government made to wipe out black people. Now, even given the history of discrimination and worse to African Americans, this might seem slightly inexplicable. Until you hear about the Tuskegee syphilis study. Now, this started in 1932. Researchers recruited 400 poor African American sharecroppers. It was a completely reasonable thing to do. There was no cure for syphilis. However, this had changed by the mid-40s when there was penicillin. There was a cure. Yet these researchers opted not to give the sharecroppers penicillin. They lied about the purpose of the study and prevented them receiving treatment. So some went into the military, and on their records it was marked they shouldn't be treated for syphilis. The study didn't stop till 1972, at which point 28 of the men died directly of syphilis, 100 were dead of related complications, 40 of their wives had been infected, and 19 of the children had been born with congenital syphilis. This study is very important in the States. It led to the setting of ethics bodies, and in 1997, Bill Clinton made an official apologies. This study is well known to the African American community as being linked to the belief about AIDS. This shows the terrible knock-on effects of this conspiracy. Because these beliefs are important, the reason they're measured is because they affect take-up of AIDS prevention and treatment programs. I'm going to take you back to Camberwell. I was having a bad day in the office a few months back, and I decided at the earliest opportunity I'd take a break and go and post a parcel. My mood got even worse because there was a huge queue in the post office. And then the people in front of me, one of the people said to her friend, "Those clocks don't agree. Look, that one says 11:48 and the other says 11:50. Seemed quite dull." To which the reply was, "They're trying to confuse us." To which her reply, "Yes, that's typical of the government." To which the reply was, "They tell you lies, and when the documents are released 50 years later, you find out they lied." His reply was, "And now they're trying to stop us living so long and discovering the truth by making us eat genetically modified food." Wise words. So this last part of the talk, I'm really supposed to making the point that when you're in queues, you may hear more talk like this. Okay, just final acknowledgement. Scientific research obviously is a collaborative endeavour. Many people have helped and are involved with the sorts of research that I do, so I'd like to thank them. I also thank you for listening and joining in with those multiple choice quizzes. And we can have some questions, I think, now.
Right, thank you very much. That's fascinating. I'm going to open this up for questions from the audience now. Has anyone got any questions? Yes, there's a question over there, and there's one over there. Okay, shall we start over there?
Right, yeah. Hi, thank you very much for that. I just wanted to ask about the idea that the individual, on one hand, will have all sorts of conspiracy theories, and on the other, have blind trust in society, in whatever. And a lot of the patients that I see display those characteristics. Well, I can do that myself, but we won't go into that. Have you got anything to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Obviously, people aren't... I mean, there's some people who are paranoid about most things, but absolutely you're right. Some people, it's only one or two specific things. You know, we haven't got that level of research about what makes people particularly paranoid about one thing nor the other. However, you would guess that it probably relates to some... well, there's a number of reasons. One issue may be that I think it may particularly relate to issues that they feel particularly vulnerable about. So it may relate to how they view themselves. Also, I think it may depend upon... I talked a bit about perceptual anomalies. Sometimes people get these sort of odd experiences. It's a bit like if you've been drunk and you wake up the next day, sometimes the world just feels awful and impinging on you, and you explain it because you're feeling a bit drunk. But sometimes people don't make that sort of attribution, they don't understand, and they blame other people around them. I think sometimes when we have odd experiences, voices, hearing voices, hallucinations would be a very good example of that. I think that leads you more into paranoid interpretations than some other things. In essence, a number of factors cause paranoia. You have to take it by the individual case. We certainly don't know why one person may be fearful of the government changing the clocks, but not fearful about, their neighbours or strangers? It's an interesting question.
There's a question over there, and then there's some over there, yeah.
You mentioned a view that CCTV cameras may fuel paranoia. I know the new government has been making noise about this as well. Am I in a minority by feeling safer in the presence of CCTV cameras?
Well, again, what I would encourage is I think we need to research this. We need to look at the psychological consequences. What we know is that CCTV doesn't really cut crime. In a few places it does, in car parks, that's about it. It rarely leads to any detection of criminals. So on the whole, it's often thought of as security theatre. That what it does is it looks like we're trying to do something. Some people may feel reassured by this, but actually what I think it does is send out a message to many people that the world is really unsafe here. And if it wasn't for the camera, you'd be in danger. And I think that's simply not true in most places it's in. And there certainly is some evidence that some people who are generally worriers and see CCTV cameras feel more worried by them. It's a short-term, what I would call safety behaviours. It feels immediately reassuring, but in the longer term, I think it maintains fears because you think, well, I'm safe because the cameras were here. You may have been safe regardless of the cameras. But we should look at it. I think with any security measure, we should be looking at the psychological effects of it, and I think that's just not happening at the moment.
We've got, over there, and there's one here,
If what you're saying is true, it sounds like the media is at least partially responsible for the perceptual distortion in terms of risk. It also seems that this is a really unhealthy situation for society. What should we do about that?
Yeah, I'm just seeing the Times flashing across this screen here. That's a debate I think we need. I think there are a number of levels that we need to look at this. Firstly, I think we just need to actually be regularly taking the temperature of society and levels of mistrust. We need to measure it, we need to talk about it, we need people to realise actually this is a thought that we commonly have. I think it's like depression. We need to be aware that it's abundant, and there's certainly some evidence that if we don't talk about some of our fears, we feel more distressed by them. So I think at that sort of level we need some effort. The media, obviously, is a tricky one. A lot of media organisations are aware of this. The BBC certainly has guidelines. I suspect other newspapers do. But I think we probably do need a recalibration of our reporting of risk. The urbanicity stuff, I think we need to be thinking about, well, how do we design our environments to increase trust and well-being? I think we need to give thought to that. So those are sort of three general areas, but I think this is a discussion we need to have. I think paranoia is prevalent, suspicion is prevalent, and we should be thinking about ways of tackling it.
I was just interested in the quantification side of things, because I think when I looked up the top 10 conspiracy theories in the world, they're dominated by engineering. Coming from an engineering background, they're dominated often by engineering conspiracy theories, like the Twin Towers, that the planes didn't bring down the towers, that there was an explosion inside the towers. And lots of the conspiracy theories to do with engineering. I wondered, is there any sense in which people are doing research on quantifying the number of conspiracy theories and their associations with different levels of what we might call control from forces that we don't trust?
I'm not aware of that. What I deal with and why I research paranoia, I focus on ideas where the person feels that they are being targeted.
Right.
And I do that work because that's the type that's distressing. Obviously, a lot of conspiracy theorists aren't that distressing to the individual. In fact, they're sharing it, and it's a group experience.
Could we have a bit louder, please?
Yes.
So I deal with paranoia that's particularly concerned with threats to the self, which is the most distressing type. People of conspiracy theories are much less distressed by them. In fact, there's sort of a group shared experience about them. So I think there's probably less research going on to conspiracy theories.
Okay. Yeah. There's a question there, and there's one there,
You mentioned a study that took place in the United States where you were talking about a 10% decrease in trust led to an 8% rise in mortality. And I was just wondering how they measured trust in this context, because it's quite easy to measure mortality, but I wondered how you measure trust as opposed to distrust.
Yeah, the United States, it was a study concerned with the idea of social capital, and it was issues to do whether you trust your neighbours and things like that. So they only had 2 questions of that. And of course there is a problem with self-report measures of mistrust, because obviously if you're in a worse area, you're likely to be more mistrustful. That's why I do the virtual reality research, because it's a good way of assessing purely unfounded ideas. I have just looked at some data within the UK which looked at more and stronger paranoid items and finding associations with a number of illnesses, including raised heart pressure, for example, and heart disease. So it's plausible that mistrust may link to worse health through stress. However, it may simply be that areas of mistrust are worse areas, and certainly in the States, probably just poorer health service provision. So it's a cross-sectional study, we don't know, but it's intriguing.
Yes.
I'm not sure how robust are your findings, because you only showed one survey. You have to have a repeated survey over time, showing the trend. And if paranoia is increasing, then probably schizophrenia will increase in society. At least paranoid illness would increase, but that's not the case. And if paranoia is increasing, what solution you are suggesting that could be used?
Yeah, I mean, I would have loved to spend a lot more time going through one by one all my studies, but I thought in front of the audience I'll just keep to the one. I've certainly replicated the virtuality studies, and it actually does fit with the larger self-report epidemiological studies. It does seem paranoia, when you look for it and you ask for it, is prevalent. And actually, I just don't think this is surprising. It's understandable that sometimes we should get paranoid. Every day, I think, we sometimes make decisions whether to trust someone or mistrust someone. We do that when we hand over our credit card or when we're walking down the street. And sometimes we get it wrong. And that's a form of paranoia. I'm not saying all of it is bad. Sometimes it's wise to be slightly paranoid. But I think it is common, and there's plausible reasons for it, and there's other studies backing up the virtual reality. The issue about whether schizophrenia is increasing is a more complex one. There's certainly evidence. It's not standard. Schizophrenia isn't standard across countries. There used to be thought that was the case, but it depends on, for example, levels of urbanicity. Also, we know that groups immigrant groups have higher rates, and so we're not necessarily sure. I'm not sure it's necessarily increasing, but there's a different question. You can have paranoid thoughts. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to cause you a clinical problem. There are different causes for that. So just because paranoia increases doesn't mean that everyone is going to be needing clinical help for it. There may be much lower levels of sort of emotional distress going on, but not necessarily seeing it in psychiatric clinics. So it's a different question about what takes mild paranoia into clinical cases.
There's a question down here, and then there's some behind you there, I think, yeah. Yeah, there's one here, I think. Oh, there's one up there, yeah.
I'm inclined to think that perhaps paranoia is not on the increase. Perhaps it's just more measurable now, because centuries ago, when people's lives were governed by folklore, religion, they would have been even more paranoid, I would have thought. It's just different manifestations of the same emotion, do you think?
I mean, yes, clearly paranoia has been, throughout history, been there. And again, I think that's because we do have to make decisions whether to trust or mistrust. And clearly at times there are obvious examples throughout history of, sort of contagions of paranoia, I think. And we don't have the data to say one way or another that paranoia has definitely increased. But I think it's a topic that we do need to think about and to at least assess as a first step. But I think there are a number of changes that could increase it. I think, the sorts of messages we get, the changes in our environment, I think they could plausibly increase levels of mistrust. Ironically, as we sort of crammed tighter together, we seem to actually sort of move slightly further apart psychologically, I think.
I just wanted to ask you about the statement you made about people being more paranoid in urban environments than rural. I wonder how you assess this, given the fact that urban areas are obviously more densely populated, so it stands to reason that paranoia may be more prevalent in that type of setup.
Yes, I was just thinking of rural areas. I was just thinking about the Archers just then, about paranoia in the Archers. In the studies, obviously, they account for more people being in cities. These studies are huge. So particularly in Sweden, they've done sort of studies of the whole adult population of Sweden, looking at where people were born, because they have fabulous records over there, and showing very clear associations of levels of urbanicity in dose-response relationships. As density of the population increases, rates of paranoia increase within the population. That's very good studies in Sweden, but also in many other countries, including the UK now. I think most epidemiologists would agree there is a very clear association.
Yeah, but how do you compare the fact that one is more densely populated? I mean,
You adjust for the proportion of people within each area. You certainly do that analysis. It's not just there are more paranoid people in areas, it's actually being born, and certainly in the early years growing up in an urban area increases your risk of also reporting paranoia.
Okay, there's a question here, yeah, and one here.
Has any research been done about links between hormonal fluctuations in women and paranoia?
Did you say between
hormonal fluctuations in women and paranoia?
Not that I'm aware of, unless anyone else in the room. I hesitate going there, obviously, it's a discussion. Is anyone aware of that? I'm not aware of it. No. I mean, there's certainly research about stress and sort of severe mental illness and ideas like psychosis, but I'm not aware of any specific to women. There's conflicting evidence about whether men and women differ in levels of paranoia. There's some evidence that perhaps women have a slightly more of the milder paranoia, but men have some of the more severe instances. But that's not always replicated.
There's one over here, and then, I think we're over there.
I was wondering if there was any correlation between popular entertainment, like true crime TV shows and kind of action thriller movies, and paranoia, kind of people taking on what they see as entertainment as more of a real-life situation than the fiction that it actually is.
Again, I'm not aware of that, but I think that's the sort of research you could easily do experimentally, I think. We could look at this. I think that's a study that people can do, which would be intriguing.
Have you got one over there? Yes, okay.
Do you think paranoia is often linked to a lack of understanding or knowledge about something?
Do I? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there is an element of that. So certainly if you're having unusual experiences going on, sometimes paranoia is the only accessible explanation you've got. Particularly, for example, if something bad has happened to you in the past, it's easily going to come to mind that I could be under threat now when something you don't quite understand is going on. So I think that is it. I think paranoia is an interpretation of what's going on around you. It's one interpretation, and often what you find is that people haven't got the knowledge to come up with an alternative explanation of what's going on, or the paranoid one is so dominant because of how anxious and what's happened to them in the past. So I think it's right. And what you do and try and do clinically is help people reinterpret what's been going on in their past to come up with a sort of less paranoid and distressing explanation of what's going on. So I think you're right. Part of it is about, paranoia's attempt by someone to make sense of events, but it's probably an incorrect interpretation in many cases.
I mean, is there an evolutionary kind of theme to this? I mean, I'm just thinking about other animals, and there are lots of animals that are very trusting of humans when they haven't experienced them, and then as soon as they experience them, they become more and more distrustful. Is it not an evolutionary kind of hardwired to, in a sense, if you're in a dangerous situation, maybe in a more urban situation, you hear more reports, to become more paranoid? I mean, could that just be a global, a normal response?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense from an evolution perspective. Just thinking about doing the virtual reality studies with cats, dogs in the VR would be a bit difficult. But I think it makes sense for us to be thinking about trust and mistrust, and clearly there's a balance there. It's going to be important to survival in particular environmental circumstances that you get the balance right. And in certain situations, for example, resources are more scarce or whatever, you'd expect mistrust to go up a bit more. So I think there clearly are evolutionary grounds for why there is paranoia and why it's common.
Okay. Have you got a question there? Yes. Yeah. I think there's quite a lot over there, yeah.
Thanks very much for your interesting presentation. I've got a few ideas about listening to what you're saying about urbanicity, and it makes me wonder, in smaller villages, lots of people, they know each other and they communicate. And in terms of cognitive psychology, the fundamental attribution error, they're able to talk to each other, check each other's intentions out. It's not surprising when you get huge numbers of people not communicating, that fundamental attribution error will kick in and all sorts of myths will come. So it probably makes sense. The other thing I'd like to ask you is, I've worked in psychiatry for about 30 years, and it always used to be, when we started our training, age was a significant thing. And late onset paranoia, that was supposed to be common. Have you got any comments about age?
Yeah, a couple of words. I think you're right about the isolation. I think there's certainly evidence about being more isolated and you have more paranoid ideas and you are more distressed by them because you're basically spending time on your own, ruminating, not finding alternative explanation for events, not sharing it. I think that's right. In terms of age, it's very clear that paranoia decreases with age. It's most common from about 18 to 25, and it comes down again. So it's much higher in younger age groups. There is then a slight increase at the older age, but it doesn't take you up to the levels of the younger age, but there is an increase. And that's partly to do with, well, one obvious one is dementia occurring, and paranoia is higher with dementia, but also things like hearing deficits that emerge and visual deficits that emerge, because that creates anomalous experiences of people. They can't work out what's going on. So there is a slight increase again in levels of paranoia with older age, but actually it's much more common at younger ages when people are starting to reach independence, really.
Okay. There's a question there, yeah. And then a few more, yeah.
I just wanted to ask, do you think there is a correlation between the recession and paranoia, and whether, because obviously I've noticed that while we're going into this sort of meltdown, the Eurozone countries, some are planning sort of bans on the veils that Islamic women wear, and I was wondering whether there's any sort of link between the downturn and the suspicious minds that have got to sort of political levels.
Oh, yeah, that's very interesting. Clearly, in the times of recession, you'd expect stress to go up with people, there's more competition, there are less rewards, and those are certainly probably fertile territory for paranoid thoughts to emerge. And I certainly have some recent data that people are finding their workplace more stressful, tend to also be more mistrustful of those around them. So it's plausible that could be another factor contributing to more mistrust.
There's a question over here, yes.
In talking about false perception of risk and unrealistic perceptions of dangers, surely a government, there might be some studies for different countries where the level of unpopularity of the government or the people in charge, they would want obviously to have the populace below being unreasonably worried about an external threat or people within that are the danger and what have you. It would seem to me as a government a perfectly reasonable thing to cultivate to make sure that your position wasn't as insecure as it might be otherwise. Are there any comparative studies across different countries in terms of the unpopularity of the government and the use of these tactics which would build up paranoid thoughts?
Yeah, well, the quote at the end of the talk was under a Labour government, but I suspect that conversation may still be in my local post office. There certainly aren't any studies of that. Undoubtedly, in certain circumstances, it's not just the media causing over-reporting of threats. There's partly because readers sometimes like to read about threats, and also there are people giving out messages for a variety of reasons to raise our awareness of threats, and terrorism would be an example of that. But I'm not aware of any sort of quantitative data on this.
Yes, another question here, yes.
Can you just talk for a little while about the treatment of paranoia?
extreme paranoia in the young, or any form of treatments, cognitive or otherwise?
Yeah. I'm a clinical psychologist, and the reason I do this work and studies, a lot of work on the studies about causes of paranoia, is to develop an understanding of the causes of paranoia, to use that understanding to develop better psychological treatments. And the particular one I use is cognitive behaviour therapy. So I do work with individuals trying to understand where their paranoid thoughts came from, what caused them to persist, and helping them to react differently to the paranoid thoughts, to review them with further information in a calmer situation, and also doing work, for example, on reducing insomnia, reducing worry, and certainly have data that if you simply, even people who are very paranoid, get them sleeping better and ruminating and worrying less, you bring down the paranoia. So all my work really is focused on developing better cognitive behaviour therapy for people who've got severe paranoia. In terms of treatment, actually people most commonly will be given antipsychotic medication in psychiatric services. CBT is not that widely available for severe paranoia. So reading the newspapers, there's a lot of stuff about antidepressants being given out a lot because there isn't that much CBT available for people with depression. There are massive efforts now to increase the number of therapists for depression. We're behind that sort of increase for people with severe paranoia, but it's certainly recommended. So the NICE guidelines, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, certainly recommends psychological treatment in addition to medication for severe paranoia. Psychological interventions really used to be restricted for anxiety and depression disorders like that. Over the last 10, 20 years, there's been a large movement, predominantly led by people in the UK, showing the benefits of psychological treatments for severe problems such as paranoia.
I mean, given that we're in a spa town, the roles of spas in the past, would one of the roles of being, given that, and also that you say that paranoia in a sense decreases with your urbanisation, it means being sent off to a spa or being sent off to the mountains or the countryside as a therapy in the past for various illnesses, in a sense would make sense, would it? Or is that too simplistic?
Up to a point. I think being in a nice environment, a calm environment, less stressful, I think benefits most of us. However, what you don't want it to be is avoidance of other people. Because what somebody who's very paranoid is, they withdraw from other people, and maybe they don't even go outside, okay? Because they think that by not going outside, they're going to avoid the people who may harm them. They therefore fail to learn that they were safer than they think, okay? So actually in therapy, what I would do is encourage people to go outside into the situation they fear, to learn they're a bit safer than they thought. And actually that's part of an element. So paranoia is an interpretation. In therapy, what you do is say, well, it's an interpretation, but let's see how good that is. Let's build some tests. So if you're fearing that all the local kids out there are going to attack you if you go outside, let's actually go outside. Let's go to the local park. And finally, let's see what happens if you actually stand outside that school gate. Let's see what happens. Let's test out this idea. Your paranoid idea is one interpretation. Let's see how realistic and true that is. So I think on the whole, spas, going off on retreats actually can be very helpful, and having a place to retreat to can be really helpful. But what you don't want necessarily is avoidance, or not for long term.
So spas over mountains, basically. Okay, there's one over there. Yeah, and one here. Okay.
So I was wondering about the kind of more milder, sort of everyday type paranoia, a bit like the crime stuff you were talking about. And basically, I know that statistically it's very unlikely that I'm going to be mugged, but yet I'm still going to feel scared walking home at night. And I know I'm being paranoid, but I still, you still feel the fear. And I was wondering, what can people do about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been doing a study over the last 18 months following up people who've been assaulted and attended accident and emergency, looking at development of paranoia when you've had a bad event happen to you and the factors that lead to that persistence. So I've heard lots and lots of really terrible stories about random attacks, and it's changed my behaviour. I do paranoia, I know what they're telling me are rare events, but actually, I've changed my behaviour in my local neighbourhood. It's really hard to change, I think. And, one of the most common ones I think around at the moment is people not, letting their kids out. When I was young, age of 7 or whatever, I was out running around, and that just doesn't happen now till much, much older. But you're not going to be the first parent to let your kid out of that age. I think it's a discussion that you need with, the people around you about, what are the threats, how realistic are they, what's a sensible strategy to minimise the risk, making sure that what you do to try and minimise the risk doesn't cause more problems, because we can all keep pretty safe if we stay indoors, fit brilliant locks and never go outside. But, obviously we're going to miss out on everything, and our physical health is going to deteriorate and we're going to die younger. So, there is a serious issue about dealing with threats. There are real threats out there. We need to know what they are, what's the relative risk, and we need to think about what's sensible prevention. It's a conversation that we have to have with our friends and our family, I guess.
Question over there, yes.
Hi, it's been said that paranoia is blame directed outwards and that guilt feelings of blame directed inwards. Would you agree?
Yeah, one theory of paranoia is that the people who are paranoid have very low self-esteem, which is kind of unconscious, and when something bad happens, they're blaming it on other people so they don't feel bad about themselves. It's kind of a theoretical idea that I've spent a lot of time challenging in my work. I don't think it's that at all. I think, on the whole, people are paranoid are often very aware of their vulnerabilities and have low self-esteem, certainly the clients I see, and the paranoia just seems an elaboration, building upon their concerns. So, on the whole, that's not a view of paranoia that I think fits. But it's, Freud, came up with that sort of idea. He was the first, really. But I don't buy it.
There's one there, and one there, yeah.
I'd like to ask a question on trust. My understanding, if you go back 40, 50 years ago, people had trust in institutions, businesses, bank managers, etc. That all changed in Thatcherism with Reaganomics, when the free markets came in, whereby the companies now started making lots of money, so people lost trust in them because they're looking after the bottom line rather than customer interaction. You also had individualism, and on the bike, social conditioning as such, that created isolation. So if you're looking at the individual, you don't know who to trust to. Morality had gone out the window as far as governments and businesses were concerned, and they were estranged from families, high divorce rates, etc. Why aren't we looking at those aspects? You can see why that's a breeding ground for paranoia, because people don't know who to turn to. And the media comes in, we can't trust what we read in the media either. This is hardly conspiracy theory. This is almost like a role of conditioning just for the economic good of the country.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, political systems of any colour really have reduced paranoia in the extremes. I think that's clear from history. It's not just restricted to what happened in this country in the 80s. But I think you're right that there are factors within the kind of sort of individual ethos that I think you're right could raise mistrust. I think that's plausible.
Are there any studies of paranoia in dictatorships? Or, is there a sort of correlation between paranoia and different types of governance, as it were?
There are, but we can all think of instances of governments that have fostered paranoid cultures within them. I think that's quite clear, and some societies clearly have spent a lot more monitoring their systems, their citizens, full stop. So, there's not hard data on this, but I think we can all come up with examples of governments that raise real threats and raise levels of paranoia.
Okay. There's a question there, and then, one here.
I was just wondering about the relationship between families, if adults are paranoid, and the children are feeling the knock-on effect from that. Do you think bad behaviour with younger children is because of the paranoia, or is there any sort of relationship, you might say?
It's a good question. You can obviously answer it in terms of a sort of genetic explanation or more social explanation. There's no studies looking at specifically the genetics of paranoia. However, there's a lot of studies of the genetics of severe mental illness, and the consensus is there certainly is a genetic contribution there that's quite high. But equally, of course, there's also lots of evidence that we can pick up fears from from our family members. On the whole, the research is done on anxious fears. It shows, there's lots of studies showing, if a parent reacts in a scared way to a dog that walks into a room, that a child can pick up that, and there's a kind of vicarious transmission of fears. That presumably could apply to paranoid fears as well, although no one's ever done those sorts of studies. So I think, yes, we pick up fears from the environment around us, particularly probably family members, but also our peers. But also some of us are probably genetically more vulnerable to pick up on these sorts of fears.
We're running out of time. I think we've got time for maybe one question more. Have we got someone? Yes, go ahead.
Earlier you touched upon the subject of perhaps insomnia or lack of sleep causing paranoia, but I was wondering whether or not it could perhaps be the other way around, and that paranoia could itself trigger the insomnia.
Yeah, absolutely. And from the study I suggested, that's a completely reasonable conclusion to make. However, just a few weeks ago, the best way of testing a causal relationship is to manipulate the factor of interest and see the knock-on effect. This is a sort of a causal interventionist approach. So, for example, you try and reduce levels of insomnia without working on the paranoia and see what happens to the paranoia. I've got evidence from a study we just finished showing that if you just work on the sleep, you lead to a reduction in paranoia. So that's a great causal evidence for that. And also I do have some longitudinal data that I just started looking at that suggests that having insomnia increases the subsequent risk of developing paranoia even when you haven't had paranoid thoughts at baseline. So the study I show is the newest published work, but actually getting some data now that shows much more the causal direction. But of course, there's bound to be a bit of a cycle. If you are more a worrier and more paranoid, that's going to keep you up at night as well. So I think it's probably circular, but certainly gathering some data suggesting that the insomnia can trigger paranoid thoughts.
I think we're going to have to call it a day, I'm afraid to say. There's thousands more questions. If you want to call Daniel after this event, he's going to be signing his book, which is Paranoia, the 21st Century Fear, in the book area, around the corner from here. So, and also I'd like to thank King's College London, my university, and Daniel's university for sponsoring this event, allowing us academics to get out of the lab occasionally and talk to everyone about our research. I think it's an incredibly important thing for universities to be doing. And so, yes, thanks to my university and thanks to Daniel. Yeah.